It will be hobby.
Maybe we should announce. No one.
By the way, I'm going alphabetical. Now the prepare taking. First time being in the conference and not presenting, so it feels good. It feels good. I don't know if I. Oh, I hope you like it. Panelists, I'll give you the 5-minute marker and list, please wrap it up. 20 minutes. I have 3 questions for each of you, in case people are.
Well, just use a lot for background.
I'm gonna do this. So do we
That's it. Two lessons.
This is what, but I'm just like, you're not doing it. Right now, people are signing up on the sheets. If they're in your, if they're in your section. Yeah. More minutes for everyone to take their seats, please. I wrote it out, so. How embarrassing. I forgot the name of my own panel, which I myself wrote.
Spaces of resistance, dissident spaces and social spatial imaginings.
Thank you.
I know that because I have to look it up.
I know. The space.
You got
Okay.
this topic, don't worry.
Hello, everyone. I hope you all had a great lunch. There's still plenty of food, so please help yourselves after our panel. This is the second panel entitled Spaces of Resistance, Dissidence, Communities, and Sociospatial Imaginings. I'm going to introduce the speakers and tell you a little bit about the panel. So this panel will serve as a platform for the exploration of space as a site of resistance and the imagination of the alternative. The presentations on this panel examine a wide range of dissident sites, such as decolonization aesthetics of Mexican narratives, politically charged dance communities in Istanbul, and anti-capitalist networks in Tokyo, and the social imaginary of an inclusive Berlin. The grassroots movements discussed by the panelists offer a unique take on transformative powers of shared social space in which communities counter the status quo and articulate divergent possibilities. I am going to introduce each panelist before they take the stage. So first we have Nazla Azargun. She's a master's student here at Global Studies UCSB and a Fulbright Fellow, again at UCSB. Her current research interests include agency formation, political mobilization, and affect theory. Please welcome Nava. So if you please come and take this. I read a little Turkish, but not so much. Can you just?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
No worries. So hello everyone, thank you for coming. This microphone working? Okay. Or can everyone hear me like this? Okay. So today I will try to show you how a leisure activity such as string dancing can become a way of mobilizing resistance against authoritarian governments. I'll be arguing that communities as such, like the communities based on shared bodily and affective experiences, become a hub and heaven of taking a step back from what is taking place in the political arena and evaluating the options and concerns and eventually mobilize resistance and undertake political action. So, but before starting with my presentation, I would like to rewind the story just a little bit to show you how swing dancing itself, as it was created in 1920s in the US, was inherently political. So it started in 1920s in the world famous Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, and it was the first and for a long time the only place where white and black communities could dance together. And in this way, it was one of the very few spaces that could defy the laws of segregation that was dominant at the time in the US. So I was at the Swing Festival just last week, and I had the chance to meet the 98-year-old Queen of Swing, Norma Miller. She's there with her partner, Billy. So when asked about in the Q&A session, when asked about can swing become political or was it ever political, this is a compilation of her answers. So we can see that inherently, because of its close relation with the contextual and political restraints of the time, swing had an intrinsic political nature, because it was in itself, by allowing two segregated communities to dance together, become a political resistance hub. And the story goes a little bit downhill after that. With the Great Depression, the swing scene wanes down and is forgotten about for 6 long decades. In the 1990s, it is reappropriated by the white American middle class, only to spread to Europe and eventually to Turkey. The swing scene in Turkey started in 2010 with the establishment of first swing dancing studio in Taksim, which was the most lively nightlife and urban relationality venue at that time. And over the less than a decade, it grew exponentially. And right now you can find a swing-related event in the urban nightlife of Istanbul every night of the week, which is like the nightlife in Istanbul close to its extinction, so it makes it significant. With 700 active dancers that are taking part in these weekly events, and at least 10,000 people who are attended at least one swing-related event in Istanbul. So the numbers are huge, and this gathering of swing dancers is owing to contextual restraints, such as the hasty urban neoliberal transformation projects and the political restraints imposed by the Turkish government, which I will be talking about in more detail. So when I was going into my site, I was trying to see whether or not the swing community can become political. And I was looking for the roots of this potential politicization. So what I wanted to see that how this dancing group becomes a community, how they establish their relationality so that they end up as an entity that is capable of eventually undertaking political action. So I first looked at some shared personal characteristics and choices. So most of the swing dancers in the community come from white-collar jobs and they work office jobs. And their sectors range from legal sphere to IT to NGO management. And they're usually middle income in the middle income range, and at least has a university diploma. They usually possess Kemalist families and happen to be raised according to those Kemalist principles. So their Kemalist upbringing and their current political stance imply that they were the part of an ex-elite, which was pushed to the periphery with the coming of AKP to the government in 2002. So this initial shared personal characteristics imply that there is a spirit of solidarity just being placed in a group based on their personal characteristics, which stands in opposition to what the AKP government represents. Politically, they are either electors of CHP, the Kemalist party in Turkey, or the pro-Kurdish party, HDP. But what they tend to agree more rather than the party affiliation is their opposition stance to the current government. So, for example, a participation in Gezi Park protests of 2013 is an important mutuality among swing dancers, and they underline this as a common stance among them. So, what I want to underline in this section is that these initial shared personal characteristics and choices act as a basis, as a gateway of creating an effective solidarity, an effective commonality, which will eventually serve as a hub, as a stepping stone for political mobilization. So when it comes to effective commonality, during my research and during my interviews, one of the trendy, in a sense, feeling that came up to surface over and over again was a shared feeling of suffocation and drowning given the political restraints imposed by the Turkish government. So depending, following from their common background and like being part of the ex-elite members, and this feeling of drowning starts to form the basis of an effective solidarity among them. Moreover, they were attributing a joy and feeling of happiness to this swing dancing, which I believe they believe to be starting from the energetic and rhythmic nature of the dance, which is accompanied by a very upbeat jazz music, and also which like the feelings and these effects are passed on to other members of dancing community when they are interacting with other members with bodily contact and exchange of facial expressions. And one final point about this effective commonality is that the initial basis of common affectivity is further strengthened by ritualization of the activity. So when you go there and undertake this activity 3 or 4 or more nights a week, you just get a continued basis of affective commonality, which will be effective in mobilizing towards a political activity. So, moving on from personal characteristics and affective commonality, I would like to underline the conceptual restraints that caused this community to become a political one. First of all, the events that you see on the screen are some of the political events that had shaped the recent years of Turkish politics. Regardless of their short-run effects, all of the events share one long-term influence. It is that as a result of these events, the AKP rule was strengthened further at the expense of communities who stand opposition to the government. So given these repressive political structure and the nature of Turkish political scene, where usual and habitual ways of politically relating to other actors in the public sphere is restrained to the greatest extent possible, people will turn to a new way of politically relating to each other. But given that when people can no longer protest or share press releases or chant or march or organize walkouts, swing will step in to create an unhabitual way of politically relating to others. Another contextual restraint that I would like to mention is the tumultuous urban transformation process in Istanbul. So this is the venue, like the dominant venue of swing dancing in Istanbul. So here at the right-hand side, is the park where the protests happen. And the street going down from here, like over here to the park, was the most popular venue of Turkish nightlife and urban relationality. So what's basically taking place is that after Gezi Park protest, the government should consciously replace steps to empty that area of its libraries. So what we see is that urban transformation projects trying to gentrify region, and also widespread terrorist attacks from 2015 to 2017 that are taking place near Beşiktaş around here, Taksim, and around here. So given this situation, it used to be the most lively point of urban life, but now it's kind of empty and people are afraid to go there. So what these swing dancers are doing, so the first studio was here, and at the heart of Taksim. And then later they moved to here. So what happens with that? It was like one of the many spaces that was a part of nightlife in Istanbul. But now, given this, what's happening in the region, it has moved to like still inside of this periphery, but a little bit in a more protected and secluded region. And it became as a hub for, as a haven for these people to take a step back from these crazy things that are happening there, and then evaluate what's taking place, mobilize their affects, their emotions and ideas about their political ideals, and then eventually take political action. So it serves as a haven where these people feel joy and belonging, and there they are able to move on to take action. So this was a reply to a question when I asked, how can you make swing more political in the Turkish context? And this was really political. So Toma is this armored vehicle that has been used to spread the masses for protest. So when I asked this one dancer how he could make the swing more political, he just said, I wish I was dancing at the time, so then I would use it as a tool in escaping this attack by the police. So what he's talking about is an example of aesthetic shock, to borrow from Hakim Bey's theory. So like the guy, instead of like contending with the police right away, like confronting it, it just uses the dancing as a way of, in a sense, unhabitually resisting and defying the police force. In which sense, it defies the usual assumptions about what political action should be, because it doesn't go on to march, which is the usual way of politically relating to other people in the public sphere. It just dances in the public sphere. And that turns out to be, as I will talk in more detail, a new way of political relationality. These pictures that you see belong to a weekly leisure group dancing in public, one of the few public parks in Turkey. So Maçka Swing was established as a weekly leisure group that would undertake swing just to enjoy the nice weather and the park. However, given the changing political circumstances of Turkey, it has turned itself into a political community. But what kind of a politics am I talking about? As I just mentioned, it is not your usual confrontational politics, because that is no longer allowed in the Turkish political atmosphere. So what these swing dancers are doing is that, imagine in the urban life, deprived of all its vitality, and where actors are no longer allowed to go on and march, chant, or involve with one another to have a say in the urban politics. So they're deprived of this right. So they just go to public parks, which is like a area of contention in Turkish urban politics, and they just dance. In this way, they become visible in public sphere appearance in a manner that is unfamiliar and that is defying the Turkish authority structure's grip. So like, you are no longer allowed to go there and chant and protest openly, but when you dance, the police does not know what to do with you because it has no regulation for this. So it is also like becomes the defiance of the usual tactics of governance imposed by the Turkish government. Because when you go and dance in this park, and when no one knows what to do, it's just they cannot come and arrest you and take you away. You're there. You appeared in public sphere through dancing. And because they don't have the regulations to fight with you, you're creating a shockwave in them. So there has been many, many instances where they will dance in front of a police group, and the police group will want to see what they can do with this group, but can do nothing because they are not allowed to just arrest people who are dancing. There's no regulation yet for this in Turkey. So in a sense, they render themselves illegible to the traditional assumptions and behavior codes of Turkish political relationality. And in this way, they are able to channel their concerns by an unusual method, which proves, I think, pragmatically effective because they're able to have their say without being arrested. And it shows that they have a say in urban politics, at least an appearance and existence in the public sphere. So there has been two recent incidents to substantialize this political stance, inherent political stance of swing dancing. The first is solidarity with Machka Park. So it is the primary venue of this leisurely dancing group. So there is recently another urban transformation project which aims for the total destruction of the park that they are dancing. They will just put a tunnel project over there. So in an attempt to establish solidarity with Machka, like the frequenting masses of Machka Park, they went there and started dancing at the backside of the protesters. So we see there is a protest going on to protect the park, and also there are dancers dancing in the park. So they are raising their concerns and try to be a party in the conflict by dancing there. And the second one, I think this is also very important, is the establishment of Swing Ahmet. Ahmet is also known as Diyarbakir, is one of the most populous cities of Kurdish provinces in Turkey. So in a sense, and what is significant about this is that it has been totally destroyed by the civil strife between Turkish authorities and Kurdish guerrilla from 2015 to 2017. So the city was demolished, and they are starting to rebuild it during last fall. So what the Swing Istanbul community has done is that they undertake a mission that they claim it to be, and they say that they will bring the dance of happiness and livelihood to Diyarbakir, Ahmet, in a sense to rebuild the city, rebuild the urban atmosphere. And recently there has been many, many workshops organized in Ahmet, and I think in a week or something they're going to organize the first party, the first Swing social dancing party. So which will be a totally new phenomenon in this Kurdish city. So, in conclusion, I have tried to show that what is initially a leisure activity, what is initially just a hobby group, can become a community tied through shared bodily and affective experiences that is potentially able to undertake political action. And as I try to show, this transition from being a political community takes place through the strengthening of initial affective ties, initial mutualities, and gathering of mutual responses to authoritarian practices. And this is important and significant, in my opinion, because it's a resistance based on aesthetic shock and playfulness, which renders the habitual ways of relating in political sphere and contending authorities, like it's kind of bringing an upgrade to that. So like if they arrest you when you're contending, you develop other ways of relating to each other in the political sphere to escape the police interaction and have your say anyway. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nazla. That was wonderful and beautifully arced. Okay, next we have, oh no, not this one. 1 second. Next, we have Raquel Baker. She's an assistant professor of postcolonial and transnational literature at California State University, Channel Islands. She specializes in postcolonial studies and 20th and 21st century African literatures in English. Please welcome Raquel.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here in Santa Barbara. This is my first time being in Santa Barbara, so I'm very excited and very short. This is my second semester as a professor at Cal State Channel Islands. I understand some of you are graduate students. So before I begin my brief presentation here, I just want to say there is light at the end of the tunnel. I got a job. I got a job in my field. It can be done. All right. Okay, so today I'd like to talk about Science Preceding the End of the World, a novel that I read last semester and fell in love with. Because it struck me as a decolonizing literature, a form I study in Anglophone African contexts. So seeing similar strategies being used in contemporary Mexican literature and available in English through translation has been a broadening experience for me. And I'm starting to see these transnational and transcontinental aesthetic strategies. I define decolonizing literatures as what literary critic Jemima Pierre calls literatures that ideologically challenge the images, institutions, and relationships that structure coloniality. In The Predicament of Blackness, Postcolonial Ghana and the Politics of Race, Pierre argues that modern postcolonial space is still haunted and constrained by the ghost of Anglo-European hegemony. The form and culture of domination established under this hegemony continues its structural imposition on identity formation. In this argument, Pierre identifies a central assumption of my field, postcolonial studies, that images, institutions, forms of identification, and social, political, and economic relationships that structure coloniality also structure postcoloniality. As such, decolonization is meant as an intervention, as work to deconstruct and challenge colonial modernity, the institutions that constitute it, and the ways of being promoted and consolidated through it. All this to say, to point to the reason that we're all here today, because decolonization is an unfinished project. So today, I'd like to present the key decolonial dynamics of this novel, which are, first of all, its structure, its pre-Hispanic mythic structure, how it conceptualizes the border as a liminal space in which binaries are blurred, and how it posits translation as a model of decolonial or liberatory consciousness. So first to talk about the structure. The novel follows the character Makina, a trilingual young woman who must leave her small hometown in Mexico, cross the border, and deliver a message to her brother in the United States of America. As a literature of the border, or La Frontera, the novel elucidates the physical and ideological borders Makina must cross, engaging the dynamics of the US-Mexico border, its racialized politics of migration, its violent economic structures fueled by narco dollars and neoliberal trade policies. Herrera's poetics challenge the racialized ideological structure of colonial modernity, which is modernity undergirded by imperialism and capitalism, by engaging a pre-Hispanic cosmovision. The novel is structured The novel is structured around the Mexica myth of Mictlan, the underworld. Mictlan, located in the myth, Al Norte, in the north, is a final resting place, the last of 9 underworlds. By engaging this mythic structure, Herrera uses symbols that come before European colonization, a clear decolonial gesture that creates an expanded reference system that challenges the psychic and symbolic legacies of imperialism. The location of the underworld invokes the aesthetics of the underbelly, and this politics of the underbelly is very salient in African literatures. And by pointing to this mythic space of the underworld, I also see this working in Herrera's work. Here we get the seedy border town, the gangsters that Makina comes into contact with, the corrupt border patrol officers, but also the transformative power. But also, I don't know why I did that, but also the transformative power of this imaginary from below. I'll keep going. By structuring the migrant's journey as a kind of heroic journey through the underworld. Thank you. Herrera posits the migrant's journey as a kind of heroic journey through the underworld, and uses the power of speculative fiction, again, the structure of this pre-Hispanic memory, this mythic register, to suggest a different temporality. The present as a kind of afterlife, suggesting the possibility of creating new temporalities, the possibility of thriving in colonial modernity's ruins in its afterlife, the possibility of flourishing in the context of spatialized geopolitical imaginaries grounded in racialized exclusion. The next element of the decolonial aesthetics of the novel I'd like to present briefly here is the author's conceptualization of the border itself. In this novel, the border is a fluid, shifting space. Herrera challenges the hegemonic geopolitical racialized imaginary of the border as an absolute fixed space, a closed field, a mode of exclusion, a kind of racialized exclusion, and a disciplinary space where hierarchies of white supremacy structure the flow of people. In contrast to this, Herrera's border is a blurred binary, literally a fluid space in the novel, as Makina crosses in the second chapter titled The Water Crossing. Herrera writes about the violence of Makina's crossing. He writes, "Suddenly the world turned cold and green and filled with invisible water monsters dragging Makina away from the rubber raft. She tried to swim, kicking at whatever was holding her, but couldn't figure out which way was up." I think Herrera's conception of the border as this fluid space allows him to, again, counter this idea of the border as a kind of fixed space that centers the ideological construction of the border and the neoliberal economic structures and racialized imaginaries that co-create hegemonic notions of the border as this kind of national boundary. This kind of spatial imaginary, undergirded by practices of surveillance, which in turn are undergirded by binary categories such as human, inhuman, citizen, non-citizen, civilized, savage, posits the border as what Saidiya Hartman calls a site of capture. Through the use of the iconic register, itself an aesthetic practice that blurs the distinction between denotation and connotation, using the shape-shifting powers of language, Herrera writes a powerful scene where Makina confronts the border control agent who has captured a group of migrants, and he's trying to humiliate them. just like to read you a bit of what the cop says to the migrants, and then Makina's response to this. So the cop says, "You think you can just come here and put your feet up without earning it?" said the cop. "Well, I got news for you. Patriots like me are on the lookout. We're going to teach you some manners. Lesson 1, get used to falling in. You want to come here? Fall in and ask permission. You want to go to the doctor? Fall in and ask permission. You want to say a fucking word to me? Fall in and ask permission." Civilized. That's the way we do things around here. We don't jump fences and we don't dig tunnels. So in response to this, Makina has a speech which ends up being a kind of climactic moment of the novel. And it actually very much reminds me of what you were just talking about, this idea of aesthetic shock, where you kind of say something that's so unexpected that it ends up immobilizing the cop who is about to kind of lay down the law with this group of migrants. So Makina gives the cop this speech. "We are to blame for this destruction. We who don't speak your tongue and don't know how to keep quiet either. We who didn't come by boat, who dirty up your doorsteps with our dust, who break your barbed wire. We who come to take your jobs, who dream of wiping your shit, who long to work all hours. We who fill your shiny streets with the smell of food, who brought you violence you've never known, who deliver your dope, who deserve to be chained by neck and feet. We who are happy to die for you. What else could we do? We the ones who are waiting for who knows what. We the dark, the short, the greasy, the shifty, the fat, the anemic. We the barbarians." And so you can see how this abrupt speech, where she uses all of the stereotypes thrown at the migrant back to the officer. And in the novel, the officer is very much disarmed. He just kind of gets in his truck and drives away. He doesn't know what to do with this. In this speech, Herrera challenges the subject position structured through the binary opposition of civilized savage, the kinds of subject positions established through colonial modernity. Through the image of the slave that you can see in the bit that I just read, where he talks about the chained neck and feet, as well as through the image of the underworld. So we're in the underworld, so we get these two images of both death in the underworld and a kind of shackled body. Herrera relates the hegemonic conception of migrant identity as a kind of ontological death. And this is very much in line with Afro-pessimism, which again, is something I'm much more familiar with. And so this kind of relation of both the underworld and death, and thinking about identity in relation to this image of the slave and shackled hands and feet, have brought me to this conception of what I call Mashika pessimism. Again, this idea that the racialized subject positions, particularly that binary between civilized and savage, in Afro-pessimism, it more looks like the binary between whiteness and blackness, suggests this kind of positioning this migrant, this hegemonic notion of the migrant as a kind of ontological death. Even the oral register of this character, her name is Makina, which very much sounds like the word for machine, relates the migrant body to regimes of capital and accumulation and fungibility. Again, foregrounding a kind of Afro-pessimistic conception. For example, thinkers such as Saidiya Hartman that relate this position of fungibility to a mode of subjectivity that's related to ontological death. So showing how these conceptions of the migrant as a contemporary subject position are antagonistic to the idea of humanity, that these two sites, humanity and migrant, are irreconcilable, allows Herrera to call out this irreconcilability and suggest the creation of a new more liberatory identity. And I think that that identity is where we get this gesture towards a decolonial or liberatory mode of consciousness. The main way that I see this working in this novel is the way in which the author relates identity or subjectivity to translation. So he does this, first of all, through his character, Makina. Makina is this young girl who speaks 3 languages. She has an indigenous language, she also speaks Spanish, and she also speaks Anglo or English. And so in this way, we can see the way that the author is creating this character through her ability to translate across many different languages. In Herrera's conception, the language of the border also has this kind of fluidity. And it allows him to suggest a subject position that is also informed by translation. I'm going to read you just a little bit here. So here Herrera is talking about a kind of language that is spoken on the border. He says they are homegrown and they are Anglo, and both things with rapid intensity. With restrained fervor, they can be the meekest and at the same time the most querulous of citizens, albeit grumbling under their breath. Their gestures and taste reveal both ancient memory and the wonderment of a new people. And then they speak. They speak an intermediary tongue that Makina instantly warms to because it's like her, malleable, erasable, permeable, a hinge pivoting between 2 like but distant souls, and then 2 more, and then 2 more, never exactly the same, something that serves as a link. So this idea of subjectivity as a kind of translation that links people together, I think is gesturing towards that sense of subjectivity in relation to the Levinasian other, a kind of movement towards the other rather than positing borders as these things that keep people out. So I'm definitely still working through these ideas. I'm excited to talk to you all about them. And again, just to wrap up, the main decolonial aesthetics that I see working in Herrera's work are, first of all, using a pre-colonial structure, so that he's going back to a time before European colonization to develop a reference system that is challenging Euro-American aesthetics. To use the border as a place where binaries are blurred rather than where hierarchical racialized subject positions are established. And finally, thinking about subjectivity as a mode of translation, subjects as relational beings, fluid relational beings, rather than identities that are constituted through binaries such as whiteness and blackness, humanity, inhumanity, or civilized savage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very moving presentation. I'm very inspired right now. Okay, next we have Katie Bender. She is a PhD candidate in geography at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research uses participatory ethnography to examine the ways that geographies of autonomous activism are remaking urban and political landscapes in Asia. Please welcome Katie.
Thank you, everybody. Happy to be here. This is adapted from a much longer paper, so hopefully it's not skipping too much, and I'm happy to fill in details after we finish up. So there is a long history of radical projects that explicitly espouse autonomous politics in Japan. And radical spaces continue to be important today in sparking mass resistance to the dominant political establishment, as well as articulating alternatives as a alternatives to a framework of resistance. Today, I'll talk a bit about an autonomous geography called Tokyo Nantoka, and how their work has sparked social movements, but is also situated beyond them. Before discussing Manuke Guest House, one of their projects in the neighborhood of Koenji in Western Tokyo. I put a quote up there that I heard while I was doing my field work that said, after karoshi, which it means death from overwork, and it's a word that has been used in Western media, including like The Economist and other publications, is that the next Japanese word to circulate into the English lexicon should be manuke. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But ultimately, they're saying that we need to create a kind of a subjectivity or a way of being in the world that is oppositional to capitalist narratives of productivity, and actually celebrate on productivity. So much like the social movement landscape, the many approaches to dissent in the scholarship are full of differences and divisions, but also intersecting work and insights. Autonomous perspectives from classical anarchist geographers like Peter Kropotkin and Élisée Reclus have been influential since the early days of the discipline, but the radical and critical perspectives that became more prevalent alongside the movements of the global 1960s only became established in mainstream geography in the late 1990s. And even with this contemporary resurgence of critical scholarship, one issue that has been identified with the existing work on social movements and political contestation in the social sciences is that it's typically embedded in a still state-centric framework. And so there's limited work on anarchist or autonomous movements that don't actually seek to influence the state necessarily as a primary goal, but rather to articulate alternatives beyond the state or outside the state. And this is one of the photos from one of the many demonstrations that they organized after 3/11, which is the triple disaster of nuclear tsunami, earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in Japan in 2011. They were credited with sparking the anti-nuclear movement. So legible social movements or uprisings against the state are only one small aspect of dissident movements or culture. A close look at the actors and spaces involved show that the power of these movements is sometimes deeply rooted in the far less politically legible spaces of ordinary day-to-day life. And it is these everyday practices that are of central concern for many anarchist or autonomous activists. The individual and collective transformation that can happen with or without the state should be acknowledged, which means looking at within relatively institutionalized movements seeking to primarily influence state policies, as well as expanding the scope of what counts as a political movement. And this would require a retelling of familiar stories. An easy example rooted in the United States is remembering that the civil rights movement in the United States was only one narrow aspect really, of a much broader Black freedom movement that looked beyond a domestic liberal democratic framework to the transnational solidarity of third worldism. Failing to look beyond the state-centric instrumentalist understandings of movements can obscure other important ways that dissent might be imagined, articulated, and ultimately brought to life. Now, in geography, this very strong influence of Marxism made for a radical questioning of the workings of the political economy and its spatialities. But in terms of social movements, this means that the production of these spatialities is a process that can be subverted or reclaimed from the circuits of capital. Still, as David Harvey notes, within the traditional left, and within the Marxist tradition in particular, urban struggles tend to be ignored or dismissed as devoid of revolutionary potential or significance, because they are seen as ancillary to the core concerns about class-based exploitation within sites of capitalist production. In addition, with the focus on the workplace in particular as a site of contention can reify divisions between a properly employed working class and others who are unemployed or otherwise resemble the properly political. Here in the United States, this would look like a white and male worker in a factory, and in the case of Japan, a Japanese and male worker. And these would be the examples of the subjectivity of a proletarian revolutionary that they're trying to get. Feminist economic geographers such as J.K. Gibson Graham have also stressed the diversity of actually existing economic and social practices. They stress the need to break away from the totalizing discourse of global capitalism as a way to affirm and create the material conditions of commoning. Their approach sees the commons not as a primarily material or immaterial thing, as Hart and Negri would argue, or any kind of ontology that is shared, but rather as the processes of creating alternative worlds. By taking the power of community economies, collectives, and other practices of mutual aid seriously, Gibbs and Graham have similarly argued against prescriptive, institutional-based understandings of political organizing. For example, the feminist movement was and is one that, quote, linked feminists emotionally and semiotically rather than primarily through organizational ties, unquote. This attention to emotion and affect as a field of contestation, fuel for new imaginaries, and subverting dominant culture has been another point of emphasis of contemporary critical geographers and other scholars looking at dissident action. And Tokyo Nantoka is one example of an autonomous geography that might draw from Marxist, feminist, ecologist, and other kinds of traditions, but as part of kind of their eschewing of labels, I think the label of autonomous geography does a nice job of covering the various ways that they articulate themselves. And this is just some images from some of the spaces that are part of this network in Tokyo. And if you're on your way to Tokyo, let me know and I can tell you where they are. Or you could pick up a map that they've made. I've referred to Tokyo Nantoka, or I refer to Tokyo Nantoka in my dissertation as a network that has organized some of the initial mass anti-nuclear demonstrations after 3/11, and that is credited for many for generating that movement. However, I was told early on in my fieldwork that the term network might be a bit too concrete, and rather they describe their relationship to one another as akin to sister cities, so having like a very loose relationship that perhaps mainly in name. Indeed, their name itself actually also reflects their ambivalence, or rather commitment to this loose connection, which is a common feature of autonomous geographies. The word Nantoka, also the name of their cooperatively run bar, can be literally translated as something, or whatever you call it, which can lead to confusion when you're asking for the bar on the street. In addition to signaling the question of what that thing is that they are, of their collaboration, Nantoka also means somehow, that they could and would manage to do something with or without financial resources, and only through the resources of their mutual aid, alluding again to their collective autonomous sensibility. There's a great book by Carl Kasegard that details the use of what he calls alternative space in Japan's youth movement. And he traces the origins of their autonomous spatial practices, like developing their own stores and shops, to within their anti-precarity and other activism. And he attributes this to the social movement landscape dominated by the trauma of the failure of 1960s social movements, and as well as the trauma of the economic exclusion and the aftermath of the 1980s bubble economy, when no one could get jobs anymore. What is left out of Kasegard's account, however, is that these spatial practices came not only out of these national histories or the social movement landscape within the country, or as domestic ruptures within a domestic liberal democratic framework, but has also been heavily influenced by both the transnational connections of global autonomous and anarchist organizing, as well as the complex local relations of the neighborhood and the city. Whatever that thing that is that they are, Tokyo Nantoka has always been a project of collaborative mapping as a form of knowledge production and relationship building. And their work under that name began as a collectively produced monthly paper with a few short pieces of writing, illustrations, and photos, a calendar of events for the month, and advertisements and a map of the shops that were part of the network. Actually, that is what this is, front page of one of their newsletters. And I guess I'll share briefly. They're obviously mostly situated in Eastern Tokyo, but have some connections, Eastern Asia, but have some connections to Southeast Asia and are actively trying to develop those. And then finally, they have also very close ties to a lot of squatter spaces in Germany and other places in Europe, which they affectionately refer to as Far West Asia. The relatively high density of Tokyo Nantoka shops in Koenji extends the functional conversion space of the shops into the neighborhood. Koenji, along with the neighboring cities of Asagaya and Nakano, was already historically associated with communities of low-income musicians, artists, novelists, punks, and their anarchic cultural spaces, and has set the stage for novels by Murakami Haruki and Neji Shoichi. And this is a map drawn by the owner of the recycle shop called Amateur Riot, and he labels this neighborhood as a strange area outside of other kinds of spatialities of Tokyo. They have been known for following the practice of appropriating public space for their own means, similar to what sounds like what's happening in Turkey. And Amateur Riot has organized creative actions such as hot pot parties in plazas, and open street spaces in plazas and open street spaces that transformed these into temporary autonomous zones. Similar in its ambiguity to the name Tokyo Nantoka, the subset of this Nantoka, known as Amateur Riot, is the name of a recycle shop, a loose collective of other stores in Koenji, including used clothing stores and event spaces, and an ultra-local autonomous radio program that broadcasts that reaches only 30 meters from their event space. Their riot also involves organizing actions in motion, such as their 3-person demo that mocked restrictions on free speech and the right to public assembly in Japan that were ratified in Tokyo and many other cities in Japan in 1949 under the post-war occupation of the US. So there's actually a very limited right to protest in Japan. Sounds a little bit similar to Turkey, where you have to have a permit to assemble and talk about anything at all. So even if you as an individual want to go in the street and hold up a sign and not say anything, the police could detain you and hold you indefinitely without charge. And as I mentioned earlier, the explosive power of Tokyo Nantoka's everyday associational politics became especially clear after 3/11. And though contemporary news coverage often obscures their contribution, Tokyo Nantoka's and specifically Amateur Riot's use of music, dancing, and sound cars to facilitate playful assembly in public space, tactics that they had developed to get around strict rules about street protest in Japan in their earlier action, set important precedents for the style of street protest in the years and the movements that have followed. So since the anti-nuke giant peak in the anti-nuke protests, those transformed into pro-democracy movements and a pro-democracy student movement as well. Their urban setting, including their proximity to central Tokyo, and the various Amateur Riot and Tokyo Nantoka shops is essential to their autonomous practice. One of the founders of Amateur Riot, Matsumoto Hajime, explains, "I had always heard about anarchists historically going into the countryside and trying to create self-sustaining communities, but not so much about people doing that in cities. And instead of being closed off like those communes, I think there needs to be this ability to exist in these social connections and then showing people like, hey, this way of living is more interesting." Like the name Amateur Riot, Manuke is a word that only circulates around a subset of Tokyo Nantoka spaces and activities, again signaling their very loose and tenuous kind of collectivity. But it signals the disruptive power of uselessness. Their deliberate lack of seriousness in their naming and other practices invites people from different backgrounds to encounter each other in these spaces, while also primarily resisting the social norm of obligatory formality with strangers and elders, centering the non-professional and non-working modes of lumpen proletariat. Having traveled and relied on other autonomous spaces for accommodations when they were traveling, and realizing the limits of their ability to accommodate their expanding network of mostly cash-strapped activists, artists, and punks coming to Tokyo without places to stay and asking them to put them up, Amateur Riot opened Manuke Guest House in 2013 in the same rundown building as a couple of their other spaces. Their guest house is run with the financial goal to make enough of a profit to cover the costs of rent and operations. But the quickly changing urban context poses challenges that require thoughtful and creative negotiations of their anti-capitalist values. Despite the problem of vacant housing around Japan due to population decline, there are few protections for squatters, and rent is expensive. So squatting is really not an option, although in other spaces, this has been a big way for these autonomous or punk communities to come together. They charge 2,500 yen a night for a dorm bed, which is about $25, which is relatively reasonable compared to the cost of other accommodations, but it's still not significantly cheaper than other hostel type situations. And difficulties with guests at Manuka Guest House also test the limits of irreverent inclusivity, and in some cases highlights the need for some exclusions to maintain that space. And I don't have time to get into a lot of the details, but the main point here is that just like actually globalizing capitalism that gives some ground critique, the anti-capitalist autonomous projects are also always incomplete and can develop because or in spite of circumstances that may contradict their goals. And while many of the increasing numbers of cash-strapped guests that come to Manuka Guest House come because of their growing and expanding connections to autonomous geographies and other places, their mobility was also fueled by the growth of the consumer capitalist-oriented tourism industry in Asia, like the low-cost, the LCCs, the low-cost carriers, that so you can get a flight from Tokyo to Hong Kong for like $10, which is wonderful in some ways and also horrific in other ways. Anyway, in conclusion, the convergent spaces of altered globalization activism against the G8 in 2008 that brought together activists from around the world, around the region and the world to Japan were made possible in part by the sustained work of Tokyo Nantuka's community economies and spaces to plan for resistance, but also to create a culture of shared values. The divergent practices within Tokyo Nantuka, with some celebrating irreverence while others finding it wearisome, and others choosing to remain more cautious, patient, and thoughtful about undoing oppression by the convergence of powerful state and non-state actors and the renewed rise of the right. The autonomous spatial practice of Tokyo Nantuka is by no means a utopian blueprint for anarchist liberation, but an example of an experiment of anti-capitalist ways of living that draw on the past and are already imagining alternative futures as part of the present, a present that accommodates difference, but privileges neither the local nor the global.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. Last but not least, we have Daniel Gutierrez. He's a PhD student, a PhD candidate, in sociology at the Graduate School for North American Studies at Freie Universität Berlin. His current research examines graduate student struggles at UCSD, where Daniel got his BA and MA, following the financial crisis of 2008. He's currently organizing with Solidarity City Berlin. Please welcome Daniel.
Thank you. So I would like to thank the fine folk of the 2018 SGS Conference Organizing Committee for putting together such an exciting forum that allows us to better interrogate our possibilities and our limits to building a different world. I'd also like to thank everyone who thought the same and decided to give up some of their weekends. My many thanks. So I came from Berlin to present to you all on some of the theoretical work I've been involved in and share some of the more interesting findings and observations I've recorded over almost 2.5 years of participant observation. But please keep in mind that at the end of the day, you are listening to someone with severe limitations. I don't speak German, and I don't have a firm knowledge of German history. So, in 2015, 4 organizations came together on a cold October night after 2 people from Toronto's No One Is Illegal gave a presentation in Berlin about Toronto's then recently established sanctuary city laws. Delegates from 4 organizations met with the Toronto Comrades. Respect, a feminist collective of undocumented women from Latin America; Mediborough, an anti-racist organization that fights for patient rights made up largely of healthcare providers and social workers; Education No Limitation, an organization made up of refugees and German graduate students fighting for access to higher education; and Interventionistische Linke, a radical left organization composed of native Germans and sub-Saharan refugees. Together, they began this process of developing what would be called Solidarity City Berlin, a project that aims to weave together refugee and undocumented struggles with right to the city struggles. Fast forward to 2018, February 2018, Solidarity City has grown to include 24 unaffiliated individuals and continues to claim the membership of Respect, Mediborough, Interventionistische Linke, and Education No Limitation, but has yet to attract any other organizations. Despite this, its proposal for an inclusive healthcare system appears to be on the verge of passing into law at the municipal level. How is this so? Aside from attempting to develop an understanding of our ability to affect the relations of force, my work here will examine the struggles within Solidarity City to translate organizational forms and strategies from elsewhere, all in compositional terms. Now, unlike the United States, the constitution of the West German state, constitution as in the process of constituting, was not ushered in through a constituent power. That is, the power that names, as Michael Hart reminds us, the democratic forms of social transformation that demarcate not only the power to rebel against and overthrow the current order, but also to create from below new democratic forms of self-organization. Unlike the processes that formed most bourgeois states, the specificity of the historical conjuncture meant that the German state was constitutionalized from above without constituent input. A critical point of intervention. Prior to the rise of the Nazi state, we must have little doubt that Germany was a multi-ethnic state and considered home to a number of racialized subjects, most prominently Jews, Sinti and Roma, and other groups that came to be considered racially, biologically inferior. Hence, when the Nazi state came to power, through democratic channels, should be added, these racialized groups were subject to genocide, such that West Germany was founded on a tabula rasa of whiteness. The German folk was all that remained through the contested process of purging. Politically, the forces that stood beyond this identity were effectively decomposed. We must observe then that in the process of constitutionalization of the German state, the forces that wrote that constitution, like all other forces that erect states, were the dominant ones. That is, law and constitutions, and this is key, are nothing but the relations of force at a particular conjuncture in crystallized form. A constitution expresses the viewpoint of the dominant forces at a given conjuncture and freezes these relations, projecting them forward into the future. In post-war Germany, that viewpoint belonged to and was systematized by a compromise between social democrats, Christian democrats, and the American government. It is in this constitution that the folk became defined and fixed through what Negri terms constituted power. What was on the outside or inside of this structural development has been historically contingent on the relations of force. No doubt, all of this is to say that the constitutionalization of the German state was never meant to make Germany a country of immigrants. The fact that one must be owner of German blood in order to claim citizenship and thus full rights until the year 2000 is made further absurd in light of the genocide upon which this proof is demanded. This is best reflected in the long-standing traditional political position that Deutschland is kind of Anbefehlungsland. Germany is not a country of immigration. No doubt this policy informed subsequent attitudes toward immigration, beginning with the guest worker programs of the early 1960s that attracted Mediterranean workers, especially from Turkey's dispossessed rural populations. Annika Marlene Hitze notes that from the get-go, these workers were segregated, originally housed in barracks that were separated from the German folk, but as the number of guest workers grew, these were then moved to blighted ghettos. The segregation went even deeper as children of guest workers had to attend foreigner classes in order to further separate them from white Germans. While much of these official partitions have since been removed, generations of social violence and mistrusts have been sown. What's more, social segregation is still very much a real thing given the way that the German school system functions, in which by roughly at the age of 10, it is decided which children go to college-bound secondary schooling and which don't. A division that disproportionately affects children with a migration background who may not yet have a firm grasp of German language, or white Germans that come from a working class background. This process of social reproduction then enforces Fatima Al-Tayyab's observation, borrowing from Ray Cho, of the existence in Germany of a process of ethnicization of labor. That is, Cho remarks in the text that this is precisely the process in which certain people within a particular society, immigrants among them, become marked as ethnics at the same time that they occupy socially inferior positions as low-level laborers. That is, a laborer becomes ethnicized because she is commodified in specific ways, because she has to pay for her living by performing certain kinds of work, while these kinds of work, despite being generated from within that society, continue to reduce the one who performs them to the position of outsider, the ethnic. Turkish outsiders and later Lebanese refugees in the 1980s, subsumed Vietnamese populations from East Germany, and Balkan refugees of the 1990s thus make up part of a flexible but constant system of ranked ethnic boundaries. No doubt, this differentialization is further compounded given the increasingly post-industrial formation of the economy, as Fatima Al-Tayyab points out. So, when the refugee crisis was generated, the German state was constitutionally ill-prepared to accept foreigners and had a long history of segregation. While refugees had been coming to Europe for some time, the visibility of conditions for refugees already living in Germany came to a head when an Iranian refugee, Mohammed Asapar, hung himself on January 29, 2012, after the German state rejected his appeal to be with his sister in a different part of Germany. It should be noted that at the time, refugees were mandatorily placed in detention centers and could not leave the city where their detention center was located. Rasapar's suicide served as a catalyst, and in no time, 2012 quickly became a movement. Refugees began to self-organize to leave the detention centers, or lagers as they're called, where they were being stored and began taking to the streets. A new cycle of struggles initiated that stemmed from the specific technical and social factors that affected refugees. The cycle would endure from 2012 to 2015. Cities became the primary battlegrounds as refugees left detention centers to go to major metropolitan areas in order to gain visibility, as Antje Dieterich has observed. Given the political composition of Berlin, its long history of radical left that, while largely insular and subcultural, has still maintained a great deal of infrastructures, Germany's capital city became a magnet for refugee struggles along with Hamburg. The organizational form of the cycle was largely defined by the formation of self-organized refugee groups, most organized horizontally through assembly-style meetings, and along language groups. This cycle was defined by the deployment of civil disobedience, and the tactical repertoire of the cycle drew heavily on marches, the occupation of public plazas, such as Oranienplatz, or the squatting of abandoned buildings, such as Olauer School in Berlin. Objectively, the cycle of struggle was defined by more defeats than victories. The two most critical victories were the development of visibility of the problem and loosening of movement restrictions. However, in Berlin, neither the occupations or the squats worked to develop lasting infrastructures, such that the plaza occupation was raised and the school squat was effectively decomposed. Perhaps the greatest blow was the visibility of the Syrian crisis, which gave the state a discursive opportunity to deploy the image of deserving refugees who flee war against undeserving refugees who flee more precariously ambiguous scenarios. Furthermore, Angela Merkel's great maneuver in which she demanded that the borders be opened resulted in pressures developed by sudden mass mobilizations, mass disobediences, and Hungary's fascist president claiming he was ready to let the refugees of Hungary die in the train stations, further helped to streamline deportations, such that 2016 became a record year for deportations. It was in such a context that Solidarity City Berlin formed in 2015. Our analysis was such that we had to retreat in scale. The ultimate level of power that we had to combat was that of the EU, not that we had to at least exercise power at the national level. But the organizational capacities and resources were simply not there. So, given Berlin's status as a city-state, we thought that fighting at the municipal level would be most successful. The political frame we developed was based on the sanctuary city initiatives that first developed in the US context of Reagan. The founding objective was to get refugees and undocumented folk access to city services without fear, thus developing their right to the city. This was, in a Gramscian sense, a positional strategy that was meant to gain footing at the municipal level in the hope of weaving with other city initiatives across Germany and Europe a network of rebel cities. Organizationally, we wanted to draw on Kurdish democratic structures in Bakur and Rojava. In theory, that meant delegates from member organizations are sent to monthly assemblies in order to bring back word from the alliance level of organization. Responses are acted upon and interventions from the organizational level are brought up to the next monthly meeting. Work groups around PR and framing, outreach, and research were developed. We urged alliance members and unaffiliated individuals to join work groups. These individuals were urged to form assemblies of their own and to send a delegate to the monthly meetings that in time would form geographically sited cellular assemblies across the city. In this way, interest groups that represent historical and particular viewpoints would be given a forum that is fused with individuals who agree with the mission of the alliance, forming together an assemblage or an ecology. Strategically, all of this was in order to develop a broad mass and democratic base that can co-define a shared viewpoint on specific policy proposals. That is, what we noticed in the previous cycle of struggle was that given the many but separated organizations that claim to represent grassroots viewpoints, state actors could pick and choose among these to develop policies and then claim their so-called representative nature. To respond to that tactic, the broad-based multi-organizational ecology would better represent grassroots than any single organization, making us a necessary player. Furthermore, in order to back what we claim to know and represent, we wanted to develop a form of policy proposal that is led from the grassroots. Rather than develop demands from above and hope that the grassroots would recognize themselves in those demands, we developed demands from below, in which we first asked refugees and undocumented folk to tell us their problems, from which we developed fields of struggle: health, education, housing, labor, and civil rights. Then went to develop a structural, technical proposal that we thought would solve the problem, and this ultimately received another round of grassroots input. It was then our policy demands were ready for presentation. It was in this way we formed our first policy proposal, supplemented anonymous healthcare for refugees and undocumented alike. Of course, no plan survives contact with the actually existing relations of force. The organizational structure we developed for the first time, that we developed for the most part works, but there's definitely some kinks. Organizationally, if individuals join a work group, they tend to not have time to develop a cellular assembly. And it also becomes redundant because work groups send delegates to the assembly anyway. In terms of capacity, the organization draws entirely on volunteer labor, and given the refugee and undocumented folk work more than 40 hours a week if they're employed, or are mostly inhabilitated if they are barred from work, then that means their ability to consistently show up has been quite difficult. Culturally, neither Germans or the refugees that we work with have an education in organizing or base building, so our ability to generate encounters with new bases of support has been entirely stagnant. There's a lot of work to be done to make this municipal ecology we are trying to develop functional and self-sustaining, but surprisingly, we've already been able to generate effect. Now, in September of 2016, the municipal government was elected in a coalition formed between the Social Democrats and the Greens on the one hand, who had a history within Berlin to help the deportation process and betray refugee and undocumented struggles while paying lip service to refugee rights, and the supposedly socialist Die Linke party on the other hand, that at the national level, its most popular leaders have taken on an increasingly anti-immigrant rhetoric. So needless to say, we were skeptical. Prior to being elected, all three parties had promised Solidarity City Berlin that they would develop a health initiative that would cover everyone in Berlin. In classic fashion, they formed a roundtable of interest groups that broadly reflected the interests of the three parties and told them to come up with proposals. One of the actors invited was Mediburo. Now, at first, there was a lot of people that said there's no way to pass an anonymous health pass. We said we wouldn't know until we tried. It was then that we emailed everyone that was part of the roundtable of interest groups, providing our proposals and our data. They green-lighted it, and even expanded the policy proposal so that it includes not only refugees and undocumented people, but Germans that lack care and EU folk as well. This would be provided through a municipally run health center that would include a social worker and a doctor. However, this was supposed to fly with first just €1 million a year. Then we heard the budget dropped to a measly €700,000 a year. So what we did then was contact the politicians to interview them and ask why they thought €700,000 could meaningfully cover the cost. Then the Linke politicians said, "You're right." And the next day, the budget went up to 1.5 million per year. All the while, half of Solidarity City thought that the most we could make with the interviews is just a public record of the failure of these politicians. So how did this happen? This is going to sound a little Gramscian, but as in a battlefield, the fog of war vanishes when with each encounter with the state. Each time some of its trenches and fortifications become revealed, the status of its troops exposed. Or we uncover that something has shifted, changed within the assemblage of institutions that is the state. In other words, the relations of force have become revealed. And what is clear in this instance is that while we will not fundamentally change societal relations if we get the health pass, we will have a legal foothold from which we can gain deeper position. Just as importantly, we should note that the actors in power, or at least at the municipal health department, are down to not only hear what we have to say, but act on it without thus far developing consequence, or our ability to develop effective consequence. Hence, the relations of force have changed dramatically from previous years. The ancient Greeks had two words for time. One was chronos, which marked the linear depiction of time. The other was kairos, when the time was ripe. The trick and the mark of a good project is to develop the ability to regroup, acknowledge the loss or half victory, and try again according to the kairos, the relations of force revealed with each skirmish. And while we may have won at the municipal level a small toehold, the relations above are quickly shifting, and with them the relations below. Given the current configuration of power, there is an avenue for change. At the level of Berlin, the parliamentary left has been able to tap into the discontent of voters who want something more left, but this is of course different from spaces outside of Berlin and at a greater scale. Regardless, this configuration, this combination of forces is incredibly delicate, and the main point of power currently lies within the state apparatus, specifically with the specific combination of forces that have won the elections. This, of course, puts us in a weak position, reliant on the position of forces immediately above us. They leave, or the channel to exercise power suddenly closes, and the kairos will then disappear. Hence, the more fundamental question that we have at Solidarity City now is outside of this, how do we develop power outside the state apparatus that is lasting and from below and that can be maintained autonomously? That's it.
Thank you for that very stimulating presentation. I had the privilege of reading my panelist's paper, so I have an insider ideas about it. So I have some questions that, if you all don't mind, I will start off with those questions and then I'll open up the floor to you, and the panelists will decide which questions to answer. Okay. So, my question first begins by talking about Natalie's presentation. You mentioned that this is like a brand new style of politics. I want to give you a tiny bit of a suggestion. I was kind of familiar with the South African Toi Toi dance, which is a dance of protest. I think this will be a nice way to link all like Harlem, South Africa, and Turkey to see how dance protests work globally. Your project is ripe with great ideas, and I would love to see like a more global stance. Your global stance, UCSB. I really like to see that. And even though you mentioned that there is some other has there been other swing studios outside, and can this be like a countrywide movement someday? And I thought that the move from Taksim to Galata was very political. And even though, insider information, your interviewee said that they are happy to be outside of the political sphere and have like a haven to not think about the politics and just be free. How has this move really affected them? I'm really interested in knowing how, like, subconsciously this political shift has like informed their political movement in a way. Raquel, I'm of a literature background, so I was very touched by everything you said. So I'm very biased right now. I did some like research on Yuri Herrera's work, and it was very interesting to me to see how myth came into play in this exploration of border. My question is, like, is the U.S. the underworld right now? And it's very interesting to see how, like, the U.S. sees itself as the upper world. But this shift was very fascinating to me. And since it's talking about the fluidity of immigration, how was the text different stylistically when it was placed in Mexico and then when it was placed in the U.S.? I'm interested to know what you thought about that. And lastly, this book has been translated from Spanish to English, and it's very heavily, it has like a lot of slangs and very like cultural undertones. What do you suppose Herrera would think about the like colonialism of his work being translated into English? The violence in translation in essence. And KT, can you also elaborate on how the state has responded to this movement, this bar, this event, and that do they wish to go beyond the bar and like create a greater movement in Tokyo or the greater Japan? And that how do you suppose this event can be a model for other anarchist movements? And lastly, Daniel, I have some questions for you too. I'm going very fast, aren't I? Sorry, I'm excited. So you mentioned that Berlin's political atmosphere is very ripe. How do you suppose places outside of Berlin do you suppose that they will like piggyback on Berlin and join this solidarity city and creating like a sanctuary city, as you said? I have a very long question. Okay. Oh, so can a pattern be found to enable organizations such as the one that your paper is promoting to promote change in other countries? And do you suppose Germany is a unique case, or in similar situations, will other countries be able to work in solidarity with refugees? So these are my questions. I will give agency to my speakers. Do you want to ask other questions, or shall we briefly comment on my questions? Questions? Let's just field some more questions. Yes, I'm coming to you.
Thank you. It might actually concern the very first one with the rising of a symbol of resilience through dance. It was basically pretty much what you asked me in the first place. Is this a coherent, did it become like a coherent movement throughout Turkey? Is it like a certain, I think it's called Turkey spot or something, like a certain, is it like, yeah, basically is it coherent as a movement? And did it like take momentum throughout the nation, or was it like just in certain places like Istanbul, like and in the park that you mentioned in the presentation.
Thank you. We'll take two more questions and then give the floor to the panelists. Okay. Thank you. I enjoyed all of your presentations today. I guess I have a question for Raquel. I definitely have to read that book. It sounds wonderful. But what kept coming to mind for me was Gloria Alcantara's work on borderland, and kind of her analogy of the border is like open wound. So I guess I was just wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about that, and then like the fluid space idea. Okay, who wants to start? Oh.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. All right. So, thinking about is the U.S. the underworld? Yeah, I think that there are ways in which you can say yes and no, which again is working in that space of liminality, right? Working through a methodology of the text being this not being able to say whether it's here or there, this kind of blur space. But certainly we can think of it as the underworld in the sense of the place that this character Makina goes and then emerges from. In terms of whether or not the stylistic register of the text changes between the parts where she's in Mexico and the parts where then she crosses over, it's definitely something that I'd like to look at. That's a great observation, but my first stab at that answer would be, I don't think so. He's very much working at this apocalyptic register. So there's only one chapter where the character is properly in Mexico. And as I said, the second chapter, the water crossing, she crosses over. So the majority of the book, 8 chapters that are she's crossed over. And even in that very first chapter when we're spatially in Mexico, the very first scene of the book is this image of a sinkhole. I showed on the slide the first line, which is I'm dead. She's dead because she's walking and this huge sinkhole opens up in front of her and it starts to swallow the cars and the people around her. She's kind of on the edge, on the precipice of the sinkhole, and she doesn't fall in. And so for me, one way that I'm reading that is that the author is using this spectacle, certainly in an apocalyptic register, but also the spectacle of the sinkhole in order to center aesthetics of speculation. So using the mythic register, I'm saying, is a kind of aesthetic mode of the speculative, right? It's not realistic. And so being able to use the speculative register, number one, centers hyper visibility, right? This idea of spectacle, the spectacular kind of biblical event of the sinkhole opening up. And that hypervisibility again allows us to think about some of the dynamics that are working on the U.S.-Mexico border as a political site, right? That surveillance, the way that migrant bodies are marked and surveilled. And so I would say that those speculative elements that I see running through the novel give it a kind of style that doesn't change across the two spaces. In relation to translation, are we translating, like, is this a work of colonization, right? Again, probably yes and no, but to, again, remind us that the Spanish is a colonial language, right, in relationship to pre-Hispanic mythic structures, so I guess it would be move from colonization to colonization, right? To move from Spanish to English. So I didn't necessarily read it as these two colonial languages being a recolonization, but really thinking about translation theory and translation as creating a new thing, right? And if we relate that to theories of subjectivity, as I think a theme that moved across all of our topics, the way in which decolonial liberatory aesthetics is about decolonizing our intimate spaces, decolonizing our modes of identification that are built on hierarchical binary constructions that have come out of colonial modernity and neoliberal politics and economic structures. I feel like there was one more that I did the underworld of those stylistic the borderland. I haven't read Ansel Judo for a long time, but wound. I guess a key way that Herrera uses the border is certainly wound is throughout. You know, the violence of the border, I think, that go to this idea of wound. But I think the biggest thing that I see Herrera doing with the border is that it is a space where things can appear, right? It's a space of emergence. And these conditions of possibility of emergence are ambivalent. They create both the inhumanity of neoliberal structures and also the condition of possibility to revolt against those structures. So I think he moves beyond wound to transformation. It's a kind of key trope of this.
Hey, yeah, thanks for the question.
You don't need to answer everything. Just like whatever you want, just comment on whatever you want.
True. Yeah, so this question of translation, I think is really a good one. I think that anytime you try to translate strategies from one site to another, I think that you always have, it's difficult, and you have to take in mind the specificity of each site's kind of technical and social composition. And by that, like, I'm kind of using like Italian autonomous terms of like what are the relations of forces and the way that they actually function within a given space, and like stemming from like the state, the economy, communities, and kind of key relations and how these all kind of play with each other. All of that's really difficult to translate, right? And direct translations, like in a lingual or poetic sense, they just don't work, right? Like you have to take into account that kind of these kinds of specificities and particularities is something that we really noted. Another point of consideration in translation is the necessity of developing these kinds of lasting ecologies and the recognition of the labor that actually takes to do that, right? On the one hand, it takes productive and reproductive space. Like what we've been really good at Solidarity City Berlin is coming out with space that actually thinks strategically and do shit, but we really lack the kind of reproductive spaces that I think my ideas over here were pointing to that really kind of go hand in hand with that kind of productive space. Like how does, like in thinking of these subjectivities, how do you nourish that kind of work, right? And if it's always thinking about strategies and what are you going to do, and constantly being reminded of how little power you have, like that burns out over time. So I think right now, like Solidarity City Berlin is at a really, really critical moment where we have to develop kind of reproductive spaces. And on the other hand, I think that, like, I like the Stuart Hall's idea of articulation, where he talks about, like, on one hand, he talks about like articulation as like finding kind of like economic pressures and ideological things. But like the point that he makes there is that this combination or this articulation doesn't have to be, it is how it is, not out of an economic necessity, but because of the agency of historical forces. it's often contingent the way that these kind of articulations happen. And when we think about articulating social bases, like we often think of like revolutionary processes or something that's like, oh yeah, well we have to like get black and brown people together, right? It's like that's how the revolution's gonna happen. Yeah, we do, definitely, but that doesn't come automatically, and that actually takes a lot of work to do. And I think especially like in the Kurdish experiences that I've read about like in these different accounts of either Darfur in Turkey or in Rojava, like how mediated these processes are of developing these kinds of articulations. Like it takes day in, day out organizers that are specifically there talking to people over time. And that kind of organizing takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it's not automatic at all. And it takes like an incredible amount of patience. And so you have to think, well, what kind of ecologies do you move around that in order to develop that? So I think that these have been, like when thinking of translations, these are the factors that one always has to consider. And so, like, it's really interesting in this Tokyo Mantika examples that PT was bringing up, because like Berlin has like these like crazy SWAT teams, right? It's like West Asia, and, but like that takes an incredible amount of actual like ecology to maintain. And like what we've seen in Germany is that the decomposition of these spaces as like kind of relations around them also decompose. And so like we have to think about how to move things together, and that just takes work. Like nothing's automatic. It's basically the point here. That's it.
So I think I'll start with the question from the audience, and one of your questions with transition, and briefly mentioned the move from Pakistan to Delta. So like the short answer will be, it is not coherent. It's not a coherent political movement. It is more like a sporadic and incidental burst of resistance. But I think that's also a step in changing and altering the system. So it is valuable in and of itself. But it is in no sense like a widespread political movement that is just all over Turkey, unfortunately. Even the swing classes in Ahmed is also like kind of very partial efforts on the part of the community in Istanbul. And I think like I heard 23 before, and also other dance movements in other countries are worth considering, because they might be examples of all these dancing communities, might be examples of how like global and at the same time like really widespread dance can be mobilized to organize resistance, or not even organizing, but showing an instance of resistance, which is a huge step towards eventually altering the whole system. And I think I really like your question about move from Pakistan to Delta, because my interviewees considered the move from the ex-central Pakistan to more gentrified Delta as non-political usually. But itself, even if it's not consciously a political move, it can still be considered very political. Because Pakistan was this neighborhood where people mixed, and like you could see all kinds of class-based solidarity examples. But Delta is more like with their hotels and high-end cafes and restaurants is more gentrified and secluded region, which I think is an example of how the Turkish political scene is for young people at the moment. Because there is this line of resistance presented by the civil community, but it's very, very small scale. What takes place in Turkey instead is like the dominant narrative about politics is that the hopelessness about not being able to change anything at all. So like this is, I think it's very, for the very first time in decades that most of the young people in Turkey consider no way out of the authoritarian structures and try to, like, the future for the young generation of Turkey is no longer within Turkey, it's no longer going to be born out of changing the structures there. So like, there is a sort of resistance and like active moment in the politics, but usually the case is that secluding and creating a haven and hub for oneself, which is for the swing communities that they move from Galata into a more isolated region. So I think it's very like a mirror image of what politics is like in Turkey for young people at the moment. That's all I'm going to say. Thanks.
4 minutes, please.
Okay. I'm just trying to give you a brief I guess it's interesting to me actually that your first question is about like how the state responded, right? Because ultimately, I think it oftentimes circles back there, revealing our state-centered bias, right?
Yeah,
And also,
absolutely.
like also the reinforcement of like, okay, so they did arrest a bunch of activists at a protest, right? And they were held in jail, some of them for 3 weeks, without real charges, right? And there's a lot of course, repressive state response. But I think I will focus also on how has this movement actually generated a movement response rather than state response. And on the question of translation, that's actually, I think, also very important for this group because, of course, working across different people in Asia means working across very different languages. And translation has been a really important part of developing these similarities. Part of what's really interesting, I think, is probably the initial response would be like, okay, great, we need to work across like all these different languages, so we should translate into English, a common language that ties us all together. But they really resist this actually, and really focusing on translating to Chinese and Korean in particular, but also into other languages as the capacity allows. And then English as a reluctant after translation, I guess. I think this work has been inspired, like actually the books that Matsumoto Hajime, one of the founders of Evolution Right, has written have been really explosive, and particularly in like Taipei or in Taiwan and Korea, and inspired a lot of activists there to learn about each other and also develop and put their energy into their own autonomous communities, like these reproductive spaces that are very difficult to sustain, but possible and so generative when they are there. And one particular, in Taipei, actually, there's a community that when I came to Koenji, was like, oh wow, like because it's you have all these different shops close together, you have a real sense of community here. Let's recreate that in Taiwan, and then they did. And so, and in Taiwan also, they were really instrumental in the anti-nuclear movement in Taiwan, as well as the Sunflower Revolution and Hong Kong and the Umbrella Revolution. So there's been a lot of really productive and generative work in response to all the different states, right, that are active in the region. And because all the states are really coming down with very repressive new policies against free speech and public assembly. And, it's, of course, impartial and always ongoing, but it's really inspiring.
Thank you